If you name your top 5 favourite series, there's a pretty good chance in at least a couple of them there was that side character or even a villain that outshined the main character, so that even when the beloved main characters win, you still feel that slight sadness and sympathy for the defeated, as they had their own journeys too, after all. But there was one moment that went beyond just sympathy. As much as I loved Karasuno and could resonate with so many of the characters on such a deep level, there was a moment where I realized I was rooting for the man fighting against them. A man fighting against his own weaknesses, against the unfairness of the world, against a reality that seemed to be screaming at him that he was born to lose. A man named Oikawa.
白鳥沢に勝てないのに余裕なんかあるわけない。
影山入ってみろ。
けど俺負け取るに足らないこのプライド絶対に覚えておけよ。
We're first introduced to Oikawa very early on when Krasner has their first practice match against Alba Josai. And he's introduced as this guy who has everything. You know, he's a top level athlete, he's charismatic, the girls are all over him. And initially that's kind of all he is as a character, more of an archetype than anything else. And so I'm sure I'm not alone in this, that I initially didn't think too much of him. But as the show goes on, we find out behind his bright, charming exterior, he feels the complete opposite way. He's filled to the brim with insecurity and envy towards those he sees as being above him, specifically Ushiwaka, the player he could never beat, and Kageyama, the genius overtaking him. In his eyes, he was born without something, and those two have that something and will always beat him as a result. It's a feeling we've all experienced because the cold truth is, not everyone is born equal. It is what it is, and I used to hate that, but Oikawa showed me a completely different view on it, and I can honestly say that once I finished reading Haikyuu and Oikawa's story, it never bothered me again. Anyway, going into the practice match, Oikawa shows up extremely late at the start of set 3. Apparently he got injured beforehand, so the coach asked him to warm up more thoroughly than usual, but he very coincidentally is ready to play right when Krasner are 1 point off winning, and then actually waits for Alba Josai to have the serve again. And I can't help but think that part of him was worried he'd see a Kageyama that had already caught him, and so he wanted to observe and see if that was the case first. When he does come on, he scores 2 consecutive service aces against Tsukishima before Karasuno changes their lineup, and it's immediately clear that he is way above anything Karasuno have faced before. Tsukishima manages to receive the 3rd serve, and when Hinata goes up to hit the ball, we see a very interesting reaction from Oikawa. He's shocked, so shocked that the ball just flies past him without a response. Of course, we do see throughout the series that no matter how many times people see Hinata from the sidelines, the first time they see his attack up close, it's a totally different experience. But again, I think there's more to it. I think in Hinata, he once again saw someone given a gift he could never obtain. And we do see that Oikawa hates it whenever Hinata is subbed onto the court throughout the series. Anyway, Krasno win the game, but when they walk outside, Oikawa is waiting for them, challenging Kageyama and declaring he'll beat them the next time the two teams play. Kageyama doesn't really say anything back, and as Oikawa leaves, he comments on how they don't have long until the tournament starts, and their receives still need work. Following this, we don't see him again until the tournament, where Karasuno watches him from the sidelines as he rattles off multiple service aces. Alba Josai win their match, and so it's decided. The next game will be Alba Josai versus Karasuno. The teams prepare themselves for tomorrow and go home. Later that night, we see a single player, alone in a very dark room. Eyes glued to the screen, Oikawa is watching Karasuno's match against Date, looking for any possible advantage he could get, any insight to beating Kageyama he could find. And as we soon find out, he realized something. The next day arrives, and it's finally time for the big match. As the two teams line up, Oikawa taunts Kageyama, asking him not to make it too easy to beat him in public because he's been looking forward to this. Kageyama's response: "We'll win this time too." The crowds cheer, the coaches give their speeches, and the players get ready. To most of the spectators, it just looks like a normal volleyball match, but the players on the court know this one is different. No one's going to die on this court, and yet it feels as though the players are staking their lives on it. The whistle blows, and the first serve is sent over. And Oikawa is as level-headed as can be, getting the first couple points with some very clever mind games. It very quickly becomes clear this is going to be tough. Krasno won the previous practice match, despite Hinata crashing into everyone in set 1 and missing 2 of their best players in Nishinoya and Asahi. With all those issues fixed, this should, on paper, be a pretty easy win for them. But one player alone has turned Albijosa into something else entirely: Oikawa. But the reality is, no matter how much time you put into practicing something and skilled you've become, there's always someone out there who can match it. And with a single play, Kageyama proves it. Just like Oikawa asked, he is not going to make this easy. Oikawa finds out that Nishinoya can receive his serves too. Krasno's libero later comments on the timeout that Oikawa's serve used to go out of bounds most of the time. This monster, who seems to be filled to the brim with talent, didn't used to be much of a monster. He must have practiced like crazy to get to where he is. It's during the same timeout that Krasno realized Oikawa's caught onto their verbal signs, with Hinata using bring or give depending on the attack they were using. Kageyama is starting to panic a bit, and the gap between the two teams continues to widen. Oikawa then comments on how, in his eyes, a good setter is someone who can get 100% out of all of his hitters, which makes perfect sense that this is his playstyle, because we know he has this real inferiority complex where he can't help but see everything he doesn't have whenever he looks at another player. Whilst he hates to see that on the opposing team, when it's his teammates, they become weapons to use. By comparison, the overwhelmingly talented Kageyama has a habit of looking at his teammates and not understanding why they don't play the way he wants. For example, the way he responded to Kunami's way of conserving energy, or Tsukishima's own unique thought process. But right now, he's trying to do way too much himself, and it simply isn't working. Albijosa have a huge lead. It's all going Oikawa's way. All his hard work is paying off, and yet, when Kageyama and Oikawa go for a joust, and Oikawa finally knocks off the king's crown, his expression is not one of joy. Not at all. You can tell he's been waiting for this moment for a long, long time, but it doesn't look like the face of someone who feels like he's won. And there's a reason for that we'll come back to. Ukai then substitutes Kageyama off to let him calm down a bit. Albijosa then go on to win the first set. But with Sugawara now setting, the second set is quite evenly matched for a bit, but Oikawa eventually manages to pull Albijosa ahead. And as a much calmer Kageyama subs in, we get our first real look at Oikawa's past. Iwazumi is the one narrating it and talks about how, from his view, Oikawa is gifted with talent. He's a natural athlete, and his skills are way above most middle school players. He even won an award for being the best setter in the previous tournament they played. But as amazing as he is, the world is a very big place. There was one player he just couldn't beat: Wakatoshi Ushiwaka, the super ace of Shiratorizawa. In the 3 years they played against him, they never took even a single set off him. Despite doing everything he could, Ushiwaka was a wall he simply couldn't break. Not just that, Kageyama showed up shortly afterwards, a player 2 years younger than him, but it was immediately apparent that his potential and skill were simply unmatched. And as we find out later, Kageyama has dedicated his whole life to volleyball, ever since 2nd grade. There's a line by Hinata where he says, "On the days I wanted to play a game or go out with friends, Kageyama was playing volleyball. Before he even set eyes on a ball, he's been playing volleyball every single day." Oikawa didn't know this. He just thought Kageyama was born with something ridiculous. But even if he was aware of how hard Kageyama had worked, it likely wouldn't have changed anything. All he knew was that this genius was going to catch him one day. The panic sets in, he practiced way beyond the point of overwork, and as such his plays became horrendously unreliable, to the point where in his next match, he was substituted out for Kageyama. It seemed as though Oikawa, despite all his work, was simply fated to live in the shadow of these two. And yet, to everyone else, including Kageyama, and as we later find out, Ushiwaka too, they all saw him as incredible. He was the only one who didn't see it that way. Later on, Kageyama, in his admiration for Oikawa, and not knowing the awful, dark thoughts inside his head, innocently asked him for advice. Oikawa's desperation and fear explodes in rage, and he almost ends his career very early on. Iwazumi asks Kageyama to leave, and then tells Oikawa he was only subbed off so he'd calm down a bit, and that he should have more confidence in himself. Oikawa bursts into a frenzied rant about how he's still not good enough to beat Shiro Torizawa, how he can't win, how he can't go to nationals. Iwazumi reminds him that this is a team sport. Sure, they don't have a single player that can match Ushiwaka one-on-one, but there are 6 players on the court. A single prodigy can't decide the match on his own. It's the 6 who are stronger that win. Oikawa suddenly feels invincible. To quote Hoshumi, who lacked far more than Oikawa ever did, "We are not limited to one way of being great." Sure, he can never play the same way Ushiwaka does, or Kageyama does, or Mia Atsumu does, but he doesn't need to. He has a very different talent to get the most out of his teammates. If there are those with gifts you don't have, find yours, or rather, discover yours, because as we'll come back to, talent is something you can bloom. Following this conversation, he goes back to his usual self. In fact, he's better than ever, and with this new look on himself and volleyball, he finally takes a set off Ushiwaka. Although he loses this match, he's found a new light at the end of the tunnel, a whole new skill set for him to work on, and he vows to beat Shiro Torizawa and Kageyama in high school. Going back to the match, it's Karasuno's set point, and the spectators comment on how Oikawa has surely got to go for a safe serve here, with how risky his usually are. But Iwazumi tells him to smash it, and Oikawa looks weirdly sad. To me, it's a reaction of, you don't have to tell me that. I already knew. I don't have the luxury of playing it safe against people like Kageyama. He not only hits it just as hard, but aims right for the corner. The guts to do that is noticed by Nishinoya. When the chance ball comes back, the usual play here would be a quick through the middle, but Kageyama calculates that, despite that, when Oikawa's back is against the wall, he'll go for the one he trusts most, Iwazumi. With their block in the right place, Karasuno take the second set, and Oikawa realizes that Kageyama accounted for his trust in his teammate, and not only does that make him a dangerous enemy, it gives him a tool to use against Kageyama. The following set plays out pretty evenly, but Albert Josei has the slight lead throughout. But when they're at match point, Karasuno finally catch them, beginning a long deuce, a grueling back and forth, with neither team able to break the deadlock. And the score ends up at 31-31, with both teams exhausted. Kunimi gets a point through, and Albert Josei are once again at match point. But Oikawa just looks sad, with a line that perfectly summarizes what's going on in his head. "Tobio, you've changed so quickly and suddenly. Someday, I just might lose to you." But to be honest, with the expression on his face, I think he's convinced himself that it's certain that there's simply nothing he can do to stop Kageyama catching him. No matter how hard he works, Kageyama is eventually going to overtake him. But in this final play, in the same way Kageyama knew, Oikawa would set to Iwazumi at the end of set 2, Oikawa knew Kageyama would set to Hinata here. Kageyama's strongest weapon, Hinata, is blocked. The ball falls to the ground, and Aoba Josai win the match. Oikawa beat Kageyama just like he wanted, but again, he does not have the look of someone who's won. Instead, to him it's more as though he's delayed the inevitable. In his mind, he'll still lose to Kageyama, just not yet. Regardless, with Aoba Josai's victory, they'd advance to the next round and continue to win until it's finally time for him to face Ushiwaka again. He's learned and practiced so much. He's waited years for the chance to get revenge, and he's trained relentlessly to do so. And yet, once again, this scene always gives me a horrible feeling, as though the universe, fate, whatever you want to call it, was telling him, look at all you're not and cannot be, the strength you lack, the height you were born without, the power you're missing. Watch it crush you. Your tactics, your teamwork, your strategy, nothing will save you. You can't beat this guy. He did everything he could, and Ushiwaka beat him once again. So just what did he have to do to beat this guy? No matter how hard he trains, Ushiwaka just always seems to be that one step ahead. Is it even possible to catch him? Well, we don't find this out until the rematch with Karasuno, but it turns out after this match, Oikawa spoke to a mysterious figure for some advice, whose identity is revealed much later on in the series, but for now I'll just say that this guy seriously knows what he's talking about. Oikawa went to him claiming he wasn't sure if he wanted to carry on with volleyball. Evidently he just couldn't see a way to ever make it to the heights he wanted to, a way to beat Ushiwaka. But his mentor sees right through him and responds brilliantly with a bit of advice that fills me with courage and inspiration every single time. Are you really sure you know the limit of your abilities? You haven't finished growing physically or mentally. You haven't mastered every skill you can. You've still got room to grow. And it's laughably obvious when it's written down like that, but no, of course we don't. We don't know how good we can become. Unless there's some professional athlete listening who's been training for 20 to 30 years, you, as in you listening, have not hit the limit of your abilities. Do you really think you can't get any better at all? It all links in beautifully with what Kita says later on in the series, that we are nothing more than the sum of our habits. Those people you look at as being more talented than you, they very well may be, but they also, truthfully, probably do far more than you. They do things you're not even considering at the moment. He sums this up by saying, what we do on a scale of 1 to 10, they do on a scale of 1 to 20, or even A to Z. There's always something you can improve on. Of course, you can only practice so much in a day, but it could be figuring out how to use that time more effectively. As Kita says, a denser or more effective 1 to 10. If you're going to complain that someone born with more talent than you will always be better than you, they will. Until you've done absolutely everything possible, you can't complain about that. If you're not going to put in just as much effort as they do, you're obviously never going to catch them. What I've noticed in myself is when I don't feel as though I'm as good at something, I subconsciously don't end up putting as much effort in. It's an easy trap to fall into, as it can be kind of hard to see the merit of really putting in the work when you're convinced it won't work out. And that difference in belief often results in a difference in intensity. So can I guarantee it'll work out? Well, no, because by the same logic, other people can do just as well as you. I can't promise you at all you'll become number one in the world, because if it's possible for you to do it, it's possible for other people to as well. The only thing I can guarantee you is that if you don't try, you never will. It could take years, it could take decades to try and catch these monsters. It is a long, tough path, much tougher than throwing up your hands and claiming, I'm not gifted, so it doesn't matter. But if you can find the courage and resilience to follow that path regardless, that alone makes you just as terrifying as the monsters you're chasing. It's a completely realistic, grounded view on the world, and yet it feels so optimistic. And we see the difference it's made on Oikawa's mindset in a number of small moments in the rematch. And so moving ahead to the next tournament, it's finally time. Both teams make it through to the semi-final, and Karasuno will once again play Alba Josai. But this time the look on his face is totally different. Oikawa is here to win. His first serve is received by Daichi, and following this he's quite quiet for a lot of the first set. But when he gets his second serve, his mentor was right. He had not hit the limit of his abilities at all. That serve that Karasuno had a nightmare dealing with last time, that was effectively the reason they won. That serve had gotten even better. This one was out, but the power behind it is enough to concern even Daichi. Alba Josai lose the first set following this, but Oikawa is in top form in set 2, using their new player Mad Dog perfectly, hitting his best serves yet, and Daichi ends up thinking something very relevant to Oikawa's story. In particular, what I was talking about a minute ago. Both teams are here to win. Both teams have practiced like crazy. A truth that is both natural and utterly terrifying. Alba Josai inch closer towards the second set, causing Ukai to respond with one of my favourite scenes in the series, with Yamaguchi being subbed in, which I've made a video on, I'll link below to watch afterwards. But despite his best efforts, Oikawa's serve and sets give Alba Josai the second set. The final set of the last showdown between these two teams plays out fairly evenly. And one thing I've really noticed about Oikawa in this set is whenever Kageyama or Hinata pull off something crazy, it doesn't seem to bother him nearly as much as it would have last time. The score ends up at 23-22 to Alba Josai, and it's Oikawa's turn to serve. And that monstrous serve that went out of bounds last time, this time it's in. Alba Josai are at match point. Oikawa is one serve away from taking out Kageyama again. From Karasuno's point of view, there's nothing and no one scarier than Oikawa is right now. Karasuno tried to calm themselves, but Oikawa goes for the kill. Daichi's years of receiving ridiculous serves just about allows him to get the ball in the air, and Karasuno claw back a point. It's still match point, but Hinata manages to block Mad Dog to bring them to a deuce. And now, the pressure seems to be getting to Oikawa again. He thought he'd finally done it. He thought he'd finally managed to take down Kageyama, and yet in the next rally, it starts with Sugawara's serve, Alba Josai's counterattack doesn't make it through, and Kageyama has all his best bikers available. Oikawa tries to stay calm and figure out who it's going to, but Kageyama simply tips the ball over for a dump. And for a moment, everything Oikawa had built up collapses. Despite everything he'd learned, his change in mindset, his practice, it's still damn tough to see those geniuses right in front of you. To see that gap between you and them and not feel frustrated. Would he ever be able to overcome that? It's at this point that the show gives us that flashback we spoke about earlier, and after reminding himself of that, Oikawa has just one answer. In the first match he fought, even if I win today, I'll lose to you eventually. Whereas now, it's simply, I won't lose. Whether that's today, the future, or both, who knows? But as Oikawa says, today could be the day to let your talents bloom. Or tomorrow, or next year, or maybe once you're 30. But all I know for sure is if you don't believe that day will come, it never will. And I don't think I'd ever even considered the idea of talents blooming until I saw the scene, but is there really any reason your talents can only show up on day one? In the same way Oikawa's serves started off inaccurate, but once he mastered control over them, his talent for serving bloomed. The same way Hinata's talent as a decoy bloomed despite it not immediately being apparent, and despite all his disadvantages. And so, the match resumes. Sugawara's precise serve drops Iwazumi to a knee. Mad Dog spike is received by Tanaka. The ball is set to Asahi, who smashes it down, and Hanamaki's receive goes very wide. Karasuno yell out that it's a chance ball, but Oikawa sets a fast, precise set from outside the court to the opposite end. Aoba Josai's coach silently thinks on how even he'd underestimated Oikawa. It seems as though his talent as a player had finally bloomed, and the symbolism on this whole play here is fantastic. Even when forced off the court by his opponents, whether that's Karasuno in this play or Shiro Torizawa when they beat him, he's still gonna come back. He gets up, he slips, he falls, and you could argue that's unfair that table's there, but he just continues to get up and keep going in spite of that unfairness. Not only was his set perfect, Iwazumi knew Oikawa could do it and was waiting there to spike it. Daichi's receive goes wide, Tanaka digs it out, Asahi hits it from the back row. The rally just doesn't seem to end. It's a relentless back and forth between the two teams, with just about every player on the court hitting the ball at some point. But this match was only ever going to end one way: the freak attack of Karasuno against everything Oikawa's built up. And in the past he feared Kageyama, he even feared Hinata at times, but now the only thought in his head is, come at me with your strongest weapon, I'll crush it myself. As the set goes up, he spots the gap in his own team's block, and knowing Hinata will avoid it, he shifts to receive it. But in spite of doing everything right, he still lost. Kageyama seems to have finally caught him. Karasuno erupt in celebration, and there's a million things that could have been going through his head at this moment. That he'd never get his showdown with Ushiwaka, that Kageyama would only continue to get better, that he simply wouldn't make it when it comes to volleyball. And yet, the only thing on his mind is soon revealed. Aoba Josai say their thank yous and walk off the court. Oikawa leads his team like a true captain to the very end. And on Karasuno's side, Daichi and Hinata both reflect on how Oikawa read Hinata's moves perfectly at the end. Without that deflection, he probably would have got it. There's an uneasy feeling amongst them. Aoba Josai was beaten. They would never have to face them and their captain's nightmare of a serve again. And yet, it doesn't feel as though Oikawa has lost yet. And as he leaves, he runs into that final wall again in one of my favourite scenes of all time. Ushiwaka warns him that he lost because he chose the wrong path, that there was a place where his talents could have shone brighter. But instead, Oikawa chose his petty pride. Evidently, Oikawa was offered a place at Shiro Torizawa, but turned it down. And there's two clear reasons for that. Firstly, the whole style of just give the ball to Ushiwaka is the polar opposite of how Oikawa likes to play. And I think it's for the best that he didn't go there, because it would have really stifled his growth. Secondly, he wanted to beat Ushiwaka. To most people, something like that would be silly. It would be petty. They wouldn't understand the need to try and prove yourself in that way. And they probably wouldn't have thought it was doable anyway. We'd seen how many times Oikawa had lost him already. But evidently, he believed he could. That belief may have been beaten out of him brutally, but it's back and stronger than ever, as he tells Ushiwaka, I've never regretted my choice, and I likely never will. But above all, nothing is over yet. Nothing. Not my volleyball career or my petty pride. Never forget that. Ever. Ushiwaka came here to warn Oikawa, and Oikawa warns him back. That long, tough path his mentor warned him he'd have to take to beat Ushiwaka, Oikawa is going to walk it, however long it takes. Not only that, he has full belief that he will win in the end, that even a giant like Ushiwaka can be taken down. No wall is insurmountable, no team is guaranteed to win. And so he gives Ushiwaka one more warning, that his junior who's nowhere near as good as him, which is on its own a great line. Despite losing that match, he no longer thinks Kageyama is going to catch him. But Oikawa also truly thinks that Kageyama and his team, they could beat even Ushiwaka. Oikawa's whole playstyle of getting the most out of his team has no limits. One day, it will even beat Ushiwaka. For now, he simply walks away. You might not have seen this next scene before. It's not in the manga or anime. Instead, it's exclusively in the recap film, but I think it's worth including here. Alba Josai walk home from the defeat, or at least they tried to walk home, before they realised that they were back at their old training grounds. Looks like their volleyball careers really weren't over just yet. And as they pack up after their final training session, Oikawa thanks his team for the last 3 years. But that's not the important part. We then see Oikawa and Iwazumi actually walking home this time, in silence. And you know, despite Oikawa's enthusiasm, the facts are still the facts. He's never beaten Ushiwaka, and the Japanese national coach is looking to change the idea that the Japanese team falls before power and strength. And so what place is there for Oikawa, who did exactly that? At the moment, the team consists of those with that power and height, those who'd learned to fight in spite of lacking it, and those with simply pure, overwhelming skill. Oikawa might fit into that last category, but to outcompete Miya Atsumu, Kageyama, and who knows who else is going to be an insanely difficult task. He ends his high school career with 0 appearances at nationals and 0 interest from the national team. So what route would he have to take in order to manage that? The magnitude of the journey ahead is surely starting to dawn on him. Iwazumi knows him better than anyone and says, "You're always going to be that guy chasing volleyball. No matter what you win, you'll always be chasing higher. But keep going without a second thought. Because you're the greatest setter there is." This isn't the last we see of Oikawa, however the next time we see him does start to go into spoiler territory. This won't contain any spoilers from Krasno's time at Nationals, as Oikawa wasn't there, but it will contain spoilers for where he, Hinata, Kageyama, Ushiwaka, etc. all end up after graduating, and the ending of Haikyuu as a whole, so it's entirely up to you if you want to keep watching or not. If not, thank you very much for watching this far. I've got plenty of other Haikyuu videos without spoilers if you want to watch more. Okay. So after graduating, Hinata Shoyo, another player who evidently received no invitations to Japan's national training camps, moved to Brazil to train in beach volleyball. It's a pretty crazy leap of faith from him to move to a whole other country in order to work his way up to be a pro. And it's here that he runs into a player on a very similar journey to him, Oikawa. We surely find out that he's a professional player in the Argentinian league. Which, I mean, that on its own is pretty incredible. It already sounds like all that faith and hard work has paid off. I already thought this was a brilliant resolution to his story and was very happy for him. But of course, it's still not the end of it. Him and Hinata sit down for dinner, they have a chat and a good laugh, and then Hinata asks him why he's in Argentina. He then reveals that the shadowy figure in his previous backstory was Jose Blanco, Argentina's former national captain and setter, and he seems to have a lot in common with Oikawa. He watched one of his games when he was younger, and Blanco didn't stand out much, but instead got the most of his spikers around him. Now Oikawa too is in Argentina following in his footsteps, but he declares that the stage he'll play on hasn't changed one bit, i.e. the Olympics. But looking at these two, I couldn't help but notice that neither of them would be there without their idols, the Little Giant for Hinata and Bronco for Oikawa. Both of these players showed them that they can do it, that there's someone in the same situation as them who's come out on the other side just fine. Of course, we know the Little Giant didn't carry on with volleyball, but from what we've heard, he certainly could have if he wanted to. And regardless, Hinata found another inspiration in the form of Hoshiumi. Anyway, as I said earlier, the world is a big place. You might not have stumbled across them just yet, but I would bet for 99.9% of people, there's been someone in your exact situation before who's got through it just fine. Maybe you'll see them at some point the same way Hinata did, but even if Hinata hadn't seen Hoshiumi, he'd still be that short, successful volleyball player. He'd still be out there, and no doubt there's plenty of others we just never see. Having someone you look up to like that who's been in your shoes before really does make a difference. But even if you can't name anyone, that doesn't mean they're not out there somewhere. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the difference in belief resulting in a difference in intensity. Neither of those two would be in Brazil without their idols, and yet here they are. Even without those chance encounters they had when they were younger, they had the potential in them to make it here. The only thing that would have been missing is that difference in belief. You've just got to have that faith regardless that you'll be alright. And as I spoke about in one of my previous Hinata videos, things usually do work out fine. The pair play a match of beach volleyball together, and in a second match the following day. Then the two part ways. But whilst he was friendly towards him and enjoyed playing with Hinata, Oikawa hasn't forgotten that match before. He's every bit as determined to clear his list of people to beat, and Hinata is on that list too. And so after asking Hinata if he'll be back in Japan in a couple years, he gives him his final declaration. A line that makes me grin every time. I'm going to beat everyone. Be ready. And yet, that was the last we saw of him, at least for a long time. Years later, on the other side of the world, Hinata and Kageyama have their final showdown. And by the end of the penultimate chapter 401, we know the whereabouts of just about every character imaginable. And to be honest, with how incredible those chapters were, I kind of forgot about Oikawa's declaration. And as I said, I already felt pretty satisfied with where he ended up. The chapter ends with the 2020 Olympics being announced. We see Hinata and Kageyama together, ready to take on whoever their next opponents are. Opponents with a banner saying, "We got up against many odds and finally stood here." And so chapter 402 arrived, the end of everyone's journeys. Kageyama and Ushiwaka were no surprise, but Hinata too made it on Japan's Olympic team. And I was so excited and happy to see that. Little did I know, there was an even bigger surprise coming. Japan's next opponent is Argentina, who apparently have been performing fantastically. Argentina, led by Jose Blanco. And who else would their setter be?
これで一勝一敗だ。調子のんじゃねえぞ。取るに足らないこのプライド。絶対に覚えておけよ。でも戦う時は全力で倒つ。
A decade on, a decade of hard work, of struggle and persistence, of failures and hardship, Oikawa stands on the Olympic court, ready to beat them all. And we never see the winner of this match, whether the protagonist gets his dream of a gold medal or our antagonist Oikawa gets his revenge. It initially remains unknown. It's said that Argentina won the last time these two teams played, but we don't know if Oikawa was on the team at the time. Given that the commentator says the biggest topic coming into this game is Argentina's starting setter and goes into detail about Oikawa's background, it makes me think this is his first appearance, because it goes into a similar level of detail as he does for Hinata. But the following spin-off chapter, 402.1, very subtly reveals who won that game. Karu has the ambition to set up a match full of old high school rivals, which of course includes Oikawa and Ushiwaka. Karu in his conman vibe has to try and convince these stars to join. And when he meets Oikawa, he says to him, "The whole country has been talking about you since the Olympics," which on its own isn't a confirmation of anything. It kind of hints that Oikawa won, but it's also equally possible that he just played extremely well but still lost. Although if he plays similarly to Blanco, we saw that Blanco didn't get as much talk as he maybe deserved. He was just quiet and walked off without fanfare. So it seems unlikely that Oikawa with a similar playstyle would get that much notice if he lost, right? But honestly, all of that is irrelevant. It's what Karu says to Ushiwaka that in my mind leaves no doubt as to who won. He tells Ushiwaka, "Oikawa and Hinata will play for the other team. Seems like a rare opportunity to crush both of them." Why would Ushiwaka need a chance to crush both of them? We know he won every game against him in middle school and high school, and has only ever played one game against him since, the Olympic game. That combined with Karu not telling Oikawa anything along the lines of, "This is your chance to finally beat Ushiwaka," or get revenge on Kageyama, only makes sense under one set of circumstances. He'd already done it. Oikawa beat everyone. Thank you so much if you made it all the way to the end. I really hope you enjoyed it because I knew this was slightly different suddenly, a lot longer than my usual videos. I've got Bokuto and Kenma videos planned, so be sure to subscribe if you want to see those, and I'll see you again soon.